I told myself it would be simple. Just a quick trip out to the farm, take a look at the tractor that had been giving them trouble, and head home before dark. Jake, my best friend, had mentioned over the phone that his dad might need an extra set of hands since Jake was away for the weekend. I didn't even hesitate when I said yes. I'd grown up in and out of their barn, helping with chores or tagging along on summer evenings, and fixing things was something I was decent at. But as I drove down the gravel road toward their house, with the fields stretching out on either side, something felt different. I couldn't place it then. Maybe it was just the way the sunset lit the sky in streaks of gold and fire, or the quiet that seemed heavier than usual. When I pulled up, the barn doors were open and there he was, Mark. I'd always known him as Mr. Lawson when I was younger, the man who could fix just about anything with his bare hands and a steady patience that Jake and I never had as kids. Over time he told me to just call him Mark, though the habit sometimes lingered. He was standing there now, leaning against the frame of the barn door, one hand shoved into his jeans pocket, the other holding a rag that looked like it had already seen its fair share of grease. "Glad you made it," he said, his voice carrying across the space in that low, calm way of his. "Of course," I said, hopping down from my truck. "Heard the beast finally gave up on you." That pulled a small laugh out of him, small but it was there. "She's stubborn. Won't start no matter what I try." I followed him inside, the air shifting cooler in the shade of the barn. The tractor sat there like a sulking giant, hood open, smelling faintly of oil and rust. I rolled up my sleeves, grabbed a rag and leaned in. Mark stayed close. He didn't hover exactly, but he wasn't far either. When I asked for a socket wrench, it was already in his hand. When I muttered that I needed more light, he shifted the lamp before I even looked up. It was easy, almost like we'd done this before. But what unsettled me wasn't the tractor or even the silence. It was the way I kept feeling his eyes on me. At first I thought I imagined it. I was used to people watching when I worked on things, waiting to see if I knew what I was doing. But this wasn't that. His gaze felt different. Steady, searching. The kind of look that makes the back of your neck prickle, makes you acutely aware of your own movements. I tried not to notice. Focused on the bolts, the wires, the way my hands were already smudged black with grease. But the longer we worked, the harder it became to ignore. Once, when I wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my arm, I looked up and caught him mid-stare. His eyes didn't dart away fast enough, and for a fraction of a second our gazes locked. His expression was unreadable, not stern, not soft, just intent. Like he was holding something behind it. "You've grown into quite the mechanic," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, almost thoughtful. I laughed lightly, trying to cut the tension. "Don't give me too much credit. Half the time I'm guessing." But he didn't laugh back. He just watched me a moment longer before nodding, like that answer meant something more than I realized. We worked until the daylight thinned, until the barn lights cast long shadows across the floor. The tractor remained stubbornly silent no matter what I tried. "Needs a part one don't have," I admitted, straightening up and stretching my back. "I can run into town tomorrow, grab it." Mark wiped his hands on the rag, his shoulders broad in the dim light. "Appreciate you coming out here. Didn't think you'd stay this late." I shrugged, though my chest felt tight for reasons I couldn't explain. Didn't notice the time. And it was true. The hours had slipped away quietly, swallowed by the sound of our tools, the hum of crickets outside, and the weight of his unspoken glances. By the time I stepped out of the barn, the sky had shifted fully into dusk. Fireflies sparked across the field, and the air carried that sharp, earthy smell that only comes after a hot day. Mark walked beside me, not saying much, but the silence between us wasn't empty. I should have felt tired. Instead, I felt restless. Where? And when I glanced at him again just before we reached the porch light of the house, I caught it once more, that look. The one I couldn't quite name, the one that made my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter. It was the way he looked at me. Like the night wasn't going to end the way I thought it would. By the time we admitted defeat, the night had settled thick and heavy over the farm. The tractor sat in the barn like it was mocking us, silent as ever, and my hands were black with grease I couldn't wipe off no matter how many times I tried. "You've done enough for tonight," Mark said, his voice firm but not dismissive. "Part's the only thing that'll fix it now." I tossed the rag onto the workbench and nodded. "I'll swing by the supply store in the morning. Shouldn't take long." We stepped outside together, and that's when I realized how late it had gotten. The sun was gone, the field swallowed in shadow. In the distance, thunder rolled low and deep, like the sky was clearing its throat. The air smelled sharp and electric. By the time we made it to the porch, the storm broke. Rain fell hard and fast, hammering against the roof, bouncing off the steps in silver splatters. Mark crossed his arms, watching the downpour. No way you're driving in that. I followed his gaze, my truck sitting vulnerable at the edge of the driveway. He was right. The gravel road would turn to mud in minutes. I'd be lucky to make it a mile before sliding into a ditch. I guess not, I said, a little uneasy. You can stay in Jake's room, he said quickly, like he'd already decided. No sense risking the road. I hesitated, not because I minded staying but because something about his tone felt careful. Like he knew exactly how it might sound. Still, I nodded. All right. Thanks. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. Too quiet. I'd been here countless times before. Weekend hangouts with Jake, dinners where Mark sat at the head of the table, his voice the steady anchor to our reckless energy. But now it was just the two of us, and that simple fact changed the air completely. He disappeared into the kitchen and came back with 2 sandwiches, sliding one toward me without a word. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until the first bite. We ate at the table in silence, the storm pounding outside, the lights flickering once or twice. Every so often I'd glance up, and he'd already be looking at me. Not like he meant to, but like his eyes found me before his mind caught up. The first time I smiled awkwardly, chewing too quickly. He looked down, almost embarrassed. The second time, neither of us looked away right away. The sound of the rain filled the space between us, louder than my own thoughts. After we finished, I offered to clean up, but he shook his head. You've done enough today. And just like that, it was time to head upstairs. Jake's room hadn't changed much since we were teenagers. Posters still hung crooked on the walls, the faint scent of cologne and old laundry clinging to the air. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the storm outside, the thunder shaking the glass in the windows. Through the wall, I could hear Mark moving in his room. A dresser drawer opening, the floor creaking under his weight. It was the kind of house where sound carried too easily. Every shift, every sigh, I heard it all. I lay back, staring at the ceiling. My chest felt tight in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was the storm, the unexpected night, the unease of sleeping in my best friend's bed while his father was just a wall away. But that wasn't all of it. I kept replaying the way he'd looked at me across the dinner table. Steady. Almost searching. The kind of look you don't give someone unless there's something you're not saying. I turned onto my side, listening harder, as if the silence could tell me what he was thinking in the room next door. The thunder rumbled again. My pulse matched it, slow but heavy. And in that moment, lying there wide awake, I knew one thing for certain. This was too close to be nothing. The storm had worn itself out by morning. I woke to a pale gray light pressing through the curtains, the kind of light that made the world feel suspended, quiet, fragile, like it hadn't decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Jake's room still smelled faintly like him, like an echo of teenage cologne and dust, but the longer I lay there, the more it felt like I didn't belong. I pulled on yesterday's shirt and stepped into the hallway. The house creaked beneath my weight, each step too loud in the silence. He was already awake. I found him standing on the porch, a coffee mug in one hand, his other hand braced against the railing as he stared out across the damp fields. The air smelled fresh, sharp with rain. Puddles shimmered in the ruts of the driveway, the sky still heavy with clouds. "Morning," I said softly, stepping outside. He turned, offered a nod. "Morning." His voice was low, rougher than usual, like it hadn't been used yet. He held out a second mug. I took it, the ceramic warm against my fingers. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The farm stretched quiet around us. Only the distant drip of water from the barn roof broke the stillness. It should have been comforting, but instead, the silence pressed on me, like it was saying something neither of us would. "Didn't sleep much," he said finally. "Me neither." I tried to smile, but it came out weak. He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Strange having the house this quiet." "You mean without Jake around?" "That and," he trailed off. His jaw worked like he was chewing over words he didn't want to spit out. "The quiet makes you notice things." I turned, studying his profile. The lines around his eyes, the way his lips pressed tight as if holding back more than he let on. "Like what?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered toward me just briefly before returning to the field. The silence that followed was heavier than any thunderstorm. Something in me tightened. I wanted to push, to ask what he wasn't saying, but I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, sipping coffee I barely tasted, my shoulder a little too close to his, the quiet too loud to ignore. After a while, he exhaled, almost a sigh. "You've been a good friend to Jake. To us. Don't think I've said that enough." The words caught me off guard. "You don't have to thank me. You've done more for me than you know." That made him glance at me again, longer this time. His eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us knew how to name. I looked away first, pretending to focus on the steam rising from my coffee. My chest ached with the weight of all the things I couldn't say, things I barely dared to think. We stood like that for a long time. Side by side, sipping coffee, saying nothing. But in the silence, everything felt louder. The brush of his arm against mine when he shifted, the faint sound of his breathing, the warmth of his presence in the cool morning air. By the time we went back inside, nothing had technically happened. No words spoken, no lines crossed. But I knew, as sure as the wet earth beneath my boots, that something had changed. Something in the silence had shifted. And it wasn't going back. The rain left everything damp and shining, the fields steaming faintly under the cautious sun. By mid-morning we were back in the barn, sleeves rolled, tools scattered across the workbench. The air smelled of oil, wet earth, and something else I couldn't name, maybe just the closeness of him. We worked in near silence. Every clang of metal, every scrape of a wrench against steel echoed sharper than usual. I tried to keep my mind fixed on the tractor, on bolts and wiring, but it was useless. I was too aware of him. The way his shirt clung faintly at the shoulders from the morning's humidity. The steady rhythm of his breath beside me. At one point I dropped a wrench. It clattered loudly onto the concrete floor, rolling just out of reach. We both bent down at the same time. Our hands collided. Warm. Solid. His skin rough with calluses. I froze, fingers pressed against his for longer than an accident should allow. He didn't pull away either. For a split second, our eyes met under the shadow of the tractor hood, and the world seemed to stop. Then it was over. Too quick, too sharp, I snatched my hand back like the metal had burned me. Sorry, I muttered, my voice low, unsteady. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes lingered on mine a heartbeat too long before he looked back at the wrench. Don't worry about it. But I did. The touch stayed, buzzing under my skin long after. We worked on in silence, both of us pretending nothing had happened, though the space between us told another story. My hand tingled where it had met his, like my body refused to forget. Later, after the sun dipped low, we sat at the kitchen table with plates of leftovers. He hardly said a word, and I matched him, the silence both unbearable and necessary. Every time I caught his eyes flick toward me, I felt that same ache in my chest, the one that whispered this was no longer something I could explain away. After dinner, he walked past me in the hallway carrying a glass of water. The space was narrow, our shoulders brushed. Just a fraction of contact, just fabric against fabric. But he didn't move away. Neither did I. That single touch, so ordinary, rooted me in place. I felt it even after he disappeared into his room, the sound of his door clicking softly behind him. I leaned against the wall, breath caught, palms damp. My thoughts spun, fighting to frame it as coincidence, as nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. Not anymore. Every accidental brush, every glance, every silence, it was adding up, piece by piece, into something neither of us dared to name. And though nothing had been spoken, though we'd never crossed a clear line, I knew in my bones, I was already too far gone. The touch had stayed. The days blurred together after that. Each one looked almost the same from the outside: chores, tools, grease under our nails, the occasional joke that didn't quite reach full laughter. But inside, beneath the ordinary rhythm, something kept building. It was in the pauses. The moments when our hands nearly touched again, when our eyes lingered a breath too long. Every silence felt crowded with words neither of us had the courage to say. By the fifth evening, the stormy heat had settled back over the farm. The air was thick, restless, and so was I. After dinner, we ended up on the porch, the two of us side by side on the steps, watching the fields dissolve into dusk. Cicadas sang, the air smelled of cut grass and damp earth, and the whole world felt like it was holding its breath. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then, without looking at me, he broke the silence. "This doesn't feel like nothing." The words landed like a hammer to my chest. I turned, searching his face, but he kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, jaw tight, voice low. I swallowed hard. "I know." My voice came out softer than I expected, almost fragile. Finally he looked at me. His eyes were steady but uncertain, like he was weighing every possible consequence of speaking the truth. And what if it's real? The question hung between us, dangerous and tender all at once. I didn't know how to answer. My throat tightened, words catching somewhere between fear and relief. I wanted to tell him yes, that I'd felt it too, that I'd been carrying it in my chest for nights now, too heavy to keep denying. But the weight of what it meant, who he was, who I was, made it impossible to breathe. I shook my head, exhaling. Then I don't know what it means. Silence fell again, heavier this time. He shifted, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground like it might give him an answer. I couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, carefully, I set my hand down on the wooden step, close to his. Not touching, just there. My fingers a breath away from his. His hand twitched. Then, after a long pause, his fingers slid just enough to brush against mine. Barely. A whisper of contact. It was nothing. And it was everything. The air thickened around us. I could feel his breath, uneven, hear the faint crack in his composure. My own chest was tight, heart hammering, but I didn't move. Neither of us did. We sat like that, hands almost touching, the distance between us fragile as glass. I don't want to make a mistake, he said quietly. I turned to him, throat tight. It doesn't feel like a mistake. He looked at me, then really looked like he was searching for any trace of doubt. I held his gaze, though it scared me, though it set fire to everything inside me. Our hands never fully closed that distance. Not yet. But his touch, light as it was, stayed. And with it came the quiet, unspoken truth that neither of us could take back. This wasn't nothing. It had never been nothing. And for the first time I let myself wonder, what if it was real? After that night on the porch, something between us shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, a current running under every word, every movement. We didn't name it, didn't even speak of it again, but the silence between us no longer felt like denial. It felt like permission. The next morning we were back in the barn, sleeves rolled, tools clattering as usual. But I noticed the difference in little ways. When I handed him a wrench, his fingers brushed mine just a second longer than necessary. When he leaned over the tractor, his shoulder pressed against mine and he didn't move away. It was subtle. Ordinary enough to ignore if either of us wanted to. But neither of us did. Around midday while we were tightening bolts, he chuckled, a rare warm sound that startled me with how much I liked hearing it. What? I asked, grinning without meaning to. You hold that thing like you're afraid it might bite you, he teased, nodding toward the wrench in my hand. I laughed, shaking my head. Don't act like you didn't nearly drop it yesterday. He smirked, shaking his head. You're imagining things. Without thinking, I nudged him with my shoulder. A light shove, playful. He froze for just a second, then shoved me back, gentler than mine. And suddenly we were both laughing. Real laughter, not the cautious, guarded kind we'd been using to cover tension before. It spilled out of us, surprising and easy, echoing through the barn like it hadn't in years. When the laughter died down, we just stood there looking at each other. His eyes were crinkled at the edges, his chest rising and falling a little quicker than normal. My grin faded into something softer, something I didn't dare call by its name. The air between us grew still again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was warm. Later that night, after dinner, I found myself in the hallway just as he stepped out of his room. We both stopped. The light was dim, just the faint glow from a lamp downstairs reaching us, and the house was quiet. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could hear the sound of his breathing, could feel the distance between us shrinking without either of us taking a step. Then he did. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned closer. Not for a kiss. Not for anything bold. He simply rested his forehead against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it unraveled me completely. His skin was warm, his breath slow and steady against my lips. I closed my eyes, my hands curling at my sides, resisting the urge to reach out and hold him there. We stayed like that, suspended in a silence that wasn't silence at all. I could feel the weight of everything unspoken, everything we weren't ready to say but couldn't keep pretending wasn't there. When he finally pulled back, his eyes lingered on mine. There was no apology in them, no retreat. Just a quiet, steady acknowledgement of what had just passed between us. I didn't say anything either. I didn't need to. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling again, I realized something that shook me. I hadn't known I was waiting for this. Waiting for him. Waiting for something to pull me out of myself, to show me that connection could be as simple and as profound as a brush of hands, a forehead pressed to mine, a silence that spoke louder than words. And now that it had happened, I couldn't imagine going back. The morning we finally fixed the tractor, the sun rose clear and golden, pouring across the fields like the world itself had decided to forgive us for everything. The air was crisp after days of storms, carrying the smell of wet grass and diesel. Mark and I stood side by side in the barn, both of us streaked with grease, sweat clinging to the edges of our shirts. I twisted the last bolt into place, turned the key, and for the first time in weeks, the engine roared to life. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he let out a laugh, low and surprised, almost boyish. I laughed too, relief spilling out of me, my chest shaking with it. He clapped me on the shoulder, his hand firm, his smile wide. Knew you'd figure it out. The warmth of his touch lingered even after he pulled away. I grinned, shaking my head. Pretty sure you loosened half those bolts for me yesterday. He gave me a look, that half smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the one that made it hard for me to breathe. Maybe. The tractor's hum filled the barn, but somehow the silence between us was louder. I didn't know if he felt it the same way I did, that strange mix of triumph and longing, of wanting this moment to stretch out forever. But when his eyes found mine, steady and unguarded, I thought maybe he did. We killed the engine and wheeled the tools back into their places. No words were needed, there was a rhythm to us now, a way of moving together that didn't require instructions. Afterward, we sat on the porch steps, mugs of coffee warming our hands, the morning sun spilling across the fields. He broke the silence first. I don't know what happens next. His voice was steady, but there was something fragile under it, like he was afraid the words themselves might scare me off. I stared into my coffee, watching the steam curl upward. Me neither. For a moment that was all. Two men sitting side by side, uncertain but not running. Then he shifted, setting his mug down beside him. His hand brushed mine, not by accident this time. His fingers hesitated, then settled, threading softly through mine like he'd been holding back for far too long. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The touch was simple, almost small, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. We sat there like that, our joined hands resting between us, the sunlight painting the world in gold. He looked out across the field, then at me. His eyes were steady. You ever think, maybe some things just happen when they're meant to? I swallowed hard, throat tight. Yeah, maybe. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a plan. But it was enough. The quiet stretched, but this time it wasn't tense. It was calm. Like the silence itself was holding us steady, reminding us we didn't need to rush, didn't need to explain. Whatever this was, it was ours. Eventually I stood, brushing dirt from my jeans. Guess I should head into town for that replacement part. Even if it's running, she'll need it. He nodded, standing with me. For a second it felt like he might say something more. His mouth opened, then closed again. Instead he just reached out, his hand brushing my arm, lingering there a little too long. I held his gaze. No words. Just that quiet, wordless understanding we'd been building piece by piece. Later, when I climbed into my truck, I looked back at him standing on the porch. He raised a hand, not a wave exactly, more like a promise. I nodded, the engine rumbling beneath me, and pulled onto the gravel road. As the farm disappeared behind me, I realized I wasn't scared of what it meant anymore. I didn't expect it. I didn't ask for it. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever this became, I wouldn't undo it for anything.